Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and check it out, I've got a package. This comes from Castlemania Games. Now, full disclosure, they sent this to me absolutely for free for the purposes of review, so I want to thank them for that. But they also sent it to me, of course, so that, you guys can see it, and obviously that's awesome. So again, thank you to them for that. If you want to check out their website and check out any of the things they have, I'll put a link in the description. And I also got you a coupon code. It's just my name, just Adam, first name, and if you use that, you get 10% off of any order of yours, including this device, if you want. So thank you for that, for them, for doing that at all, because obviously they didn't have to do that. And no, I don't get a kickback. That's just something I arranged with them for your benefit. But yeah, okay, inside. So we have a note, including a sticker and some information about this device, but I think I already know what I need to know. Box, actual device, and inside we have, oh, that's adorable. Now I give them props for the packaging. It's like a little chibi GameCube. That's very nice. Oh, and it even has a handle on it. That's that's nice. That's sweet. Anyway, so we're gonna open it up and we're gonna talk about it now. Yeah, the long and the short of it is, you're probably like, all right, what's this thing? Actually, a lot of you probably already know, because the videos on this thing have been out for a while, a lot of reviews, but my schedule's hectic, and I finally had a chance to talk about it, and I wanted to talk about it, because it's really very much right up my alley. Now, I want to take the tape off of this thing without damaging it, because this box is very, very neat. So let me just go ahead and do that right there. That'll be fine. And we take it out of here. And inside we have is some instructions and ultimately a little bit of plastic, and inside that a very tiny little device. Now this thing, basically, to summarize what this is a little device that you connect in the back of your GameCube, and it allows you to get HDMI output out of your GameCube. It's the shortest possible explanation. Now we're going to go into some details on that. We're going to do a little bit of a review of this thing, what it is, like why you would need it, especially depending upon your region. We're going to talk about that too. And ultimately my final thoughts on it, if I can recommend it or not. So the most basic thing we'll talk about here is just inserting it and connecting it. Now, as you can see, there really is not much to this. So let's talk about the device itself. Basically, it's just a little component adapter for the GameCube to replace the very expensive component cables. And in place, you get a more modern and convenient HDMI signal. Now, the first thing you know, or will have to know when using it, is you have your GameCube. You love it. It's great. It's got all sorts of awesome games on it, and you want them to look good. And there's a whole host of different options out there that I've talked about in the past, and we'll do a little bit more of that soon. But yeah, but if you'll notice, you've looked at the back of your GameCube, you have two possible options. You have one that has two ports, as you see on this model, or you have one that has a single port on the back. Unfortunately, if you have the single port version, you cannot use this device. This one is specifically intended for the versions that have both ports. The reason that could be the case for you is that Nintendo later stripped out the component ports on the GameCubes, which is unfortunate. But yeah, you need both ports. Now, the second port, the AV port, is actually just a dummy piece of plastic. It actually doesn't really do anything. So you'll notice that right away. And then you'll notice it takes a little bit of force to get it in there, and then it clicks in. You will hear a solid click, and once you hear that, you're good to go. If you're unsure, just push until it clicks, and if you're not really unsure, try turning it on. There's a light on the back of the device that right here in the red area that will illuminate if the GameCube is connected properly to the device. But anyway, so once you have it in there, it feels very sturdy. It still feels very solid. The reason it uses both ports is actually for additional stability. They didn't want to put all the pressure on the component port, so they added that piece of plastic to use the analog port for additional support, so that it becomes more stable. They also, for that reason, put the HDMI port on this side. That way it's just less pressure being applied to the part of the console that actually matters for this purpose. It actually also has on board software that contains firmware that allows you to basically tinker with the internal settings. Now, I just so happen to have an HDMI modified GameCube over here, which will be a tad more significant later. But this HDMI modified GameCube has the same exact software built into it. So I've used the software before. It's nice, because it gives you a bunch of options, but the truth is you don't really need access to most of them. The only one that kind of matters, and it gives me a lot of hope for this device, is that, long story short, the GameCube natively outputs 480i unless you use the progressive scan high resolution modes. That can be problematic when you're using an HDMI TV connection, because a lot of HDMI monitors and televisions cannot understand 480i signals through an HDMI port. So the software on board this GameCube, as well as this device, automatically compensates for that and basically gives you an artificial 480p image for any sort of 480i title. Long story short, what it means is this will work on your HDMI TV. That's what it means. But it also has additional benefits in there. Now, to get access to it, my understanding is you can use a universal remote. I obviously haven't used the device yet. You saw me unbox it. With the HDMI GameCube, you could actually get access to it through the controller. I will test that and see if that is the case with this particular device, but something tells me it's not going to work the same way. Now that said, there's really not much else to say about it without having used it. So there is one button on the back here, and to be honest, I don't even know what that does. Maybe we'll find that out later. But yeah, so you might be questioning, okay, why do I need this particular device as opposed to other devices? What are my options? All that stuff. Well, here's the thing. I have talked about various outputs for the GameCube many times, including a video I did completely dedicated to this particular GameCube and other options. When it comes to the GameCube and playing games, there is a whole ton of options, and none of them are going to be perfect. All of them have pluses and minuses, but basically here's the rundown of the history of it. When Nintendo made the GameCube, they put the component port into it with the intention that you would have access to high resolution 480p, it was high resolution at the time, high resolution modes in games using component cables. That was the idea. Now, in Japan, this was much more well adopted. They actually released the cables in stores. Wonderful. In North America, they didn't really do that. What they had ended up doing was releasing the cables in very limited quantities at only select spots. It wasn't very easy to come by the cables. And Europe and Australia got completely screwed. Not only were the cables never released there, the high resolution modes were disabled from PAL versions of the games. So to make sure that's clear, if you have the Japanese version of Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, and you play it on this GameCube, or a GameCube with the component cables, congratulations, you have access to the high definition progressive scan modes. If you take the American version of the exact same game, Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, play it on this GameCube, or a GameCube with component cables, congratulations, high definition modes. You take the PAL version of the exact same game, play it on this, or a PAL dedicated GameCube. Sorry, Charlie, no high definition modes for you. So what exactly does that mean for people in Australia or Europe considering this device? It means that you can use this, it will work on your machine, but the maximum output you're going to get with PAL versions of games is 480i. Now, the ironic part is it's not your console. If you have a PAL GameCube and a North American copy of Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, well, and the ability, like an import disc that allows you to play it, because region coding, but if you have that, and you have this device, it's really in there very strong, and you have this device, you can use the high definition modes. But basically what I'm saying is, PAL users, beware, this is not going to be as beneficial for you. This is intended for progressive scan games and progressive scan capable users. This is most notably intended for basically people in the US, Canada, and Japan. Not so much Europe or Australia, but you are capable of using it. There's just an asterisk next to it. So you would have to either have pirated North American or Japanese games, or just an imported set of games you want from those countries to take full advantage. So keep that in mind. But it will ultimately work. But however, the way they compensated you for that was they gave you RGB Scart in the GameCube. So ironically, in the early days of the GameCube, when it was out, in North America for the GameCube, we were all using composite, and it looked terrible. You know, the yellow one, the one that it came with, that looks like shit, and it can be massively upgraded, and that's exactly what this device is going to do. Some of us would have access to S-Video, which looked better, but still was not that great, and then the super elite among us had access to the component cables back in the day, but that was incredibly rare, and it's still rare now. But you guys had RGB, which was right in between S-Video and component. We don't have that. The North American versions, the NTSC, both Japanese and American GameCubes, the RGB mode was completely disabled. It doesn't work at all. So fascinating. You guys won back then, and now we got the last laugh on that one, I guess. But regardless, you will have the ability to use this, just again, there is a bit of a catch there. So that's the other thing I want to bring up here is I know a lot of people will be like, you know what, I don't care. I know the cables are expensive. This thing's expensive. I'm just going to use my Wii, and I'm going to use the component cables for the Wii. Yes, certainly you have that option, but be aware that component cables through the Wii are not as good as component cables or something like this through the GameCube. The GameCube is much better at outputting its own games than the Wii is. The Wii is the cheaper alternative. It's simply not the best one. And of course, I know people will throw out, hey, what about emulators and playing on the Wii U through the emulator modes and on PCs, of course, blah, 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 etc. If you bring that up, you're obviously not the intended demographic. This is meant for, it is a niche product, let's be honest about that. It's intended for dedicated console gamers who just want to push and get the best out of their actual console. So keep that in mind. Now, the retail on this device is $150 US, which is kind of a bit, but again, you have that coupon code if you want to use it. That gets you to $135. If you live in the US, you also get free shipping with that. So keep that in mind. It is an option. But that said, I do obviously want to test it out, show it to you, and see how it turns out. But I'm also, honestly, really excited to see how it compares to this, because when I did a video on this thing, the #1 complaint was, yeah, but then it's just that GameCube. You know, it's limited to just that one. What about something more universal? Well, that exists now. I mean, there have been other options, and to be honest, I know people will bring those up. There's cheaper alternatives to this. Now, I have not reviewed any of them, so it would be unfair of me to criticize or judge in any way, shape, or form. I've had access to one of them briefly for a matter of minutes at the Missouri Game Con. The only difference I've noticed offhand is basically presentation and quality of product. In this case, it's obviously, you know, more well packaged, and it's designed to be more stable. The early versions of the cheaper ones were kind of a 3D printed mold, and obviously were kind of a looser design. Now, that doesn't mean they stayed that way. I have not used updated versions. So again, there's gonna be people out there who say, hey, there's a cheaper one. That's true. And maybe that's the route for you. This is the route for some other people. Hopefully, maybe. Let's find out for sure though. Okay guys, I've been using this for a while, so now it's time for final thoughts. And again, reminder, you're gonna see comparison footage towards the end of the video. As you can see, I have a whole array of GameCubes out here to make a few different points. But before we do that though, a couple of just last things to note about it. One, I mentioned that button, that, you know, little clicking button on the back. I wasn't really sure what that was. Now I know what it is. It's the way you program the universal remote to get access to that menu. This basically is just, you know, a way to sync it. Now again, for people who aren't totally clear on that situation, there is a menu on board this thing that allows you to get access to various options. It exists as well on the HDMI modified GameCube over here. However, that menu is not essential, it's just a bonus feature, and I'm glad it's included, but to be honest, it's not the easiest thing to get to without the universal remote. The HDMI modified GameCube had the ability to, because it's modified, there was a controller configuration where you hold 2 triggers, press a couple of face buttons, and the menu would prompt. I was wondering if it worked on this. It does not, so keep that in mind. So you do need a universal remote if you want access to that menu, but again, really not that big of a deal in the end. So other than that, the only other things there really are to say is just a couple of observations, the most obvious of which being the price. See, here's the thing. This thing is a good device. It offers a good picture quality, and it's obviously very convenient because you can use it on essentially any model of the GameCube, save for 2, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the price, for the price point, at 150, even 135 with the discount, which again, if you want to do that, link in the description with my name as a coupon code. even with that, I can see why that may not be good enough for a lot of people to just not go with or to alternatively go with the cheaper options. Like, for example, this is definitely better, like infinitely better than the actual component cables. But I imagine the component cables are going to start getting cheaper now that things like this exist. And of course, a lot of people will say, oh, the Wii with the GameCube component cables, blah, blah, blah. Or Wii with the component cables, and that's how I want to play my GameCube games. That's obviously a cheaper option. This is vastly superior to that. But from a financial standpoint, it might be too much to overcome the additional benefits. You get what I'm saying? So this really is a device intended for the enthusiast. And so that's kind of who I aim it at. That said, it's still very good. And there are cheaper alternatives to the HDMI output as well. However, they're not generally, as far as I understand, as built as well. Now again, I don't have those. I have not reviewed those, so it would be unfair of me to be like definitely sure that that's the case, because I'm not. I can only speak for this device, and as an actual device, it's nice. It's just the budget on it. Maybe if it was more like in the $100 range, this would be a slightly different conversation, but that's what it is. So other things to note about it is, one thing I noticed that I didn't really see that many people talking about is the sound. Now the sound on this thing is good, and if I never mentioned this, you'd probably never even know it, but I'm trying to be thorough. Now if you have the original GameCube component cables, you'll know that like the way Nintendo designed it, you only got video out of the component port. Audio actually came from the AV port. Well, as I've mentioned a few times now, this device uses the AV port as just a generic piece of plastic to kind of just create additional stability. It doesn't have any pins in it. So in other words, it's not getting audio from that port. So it's getting audio from the component port. Now, I think it was actually my buddy John Riggs who noticed that when he compared direct comparisons of footage, that the audio was slightly different. And so what I'm guessing is, because Nintendo really didn't design the audio to come from there, that's resulting in some sort of distortion. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying that the audio is bad. I'm simply saying that it's probably not what was intended to be heard in that manner. And if I were to give them advice on future models of this, I would say, actually, like, use that port to your advantage, not just as a plastic piece to hold for additional stability. Try to get the audio out of there. That would be my suggestion. Now that said, that port's interesting because it causes an additional issue, which was that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you can't use this on GameCubes that only have the AV port. That one makes sense. But there is another model of the GameCube that it does not work with, which is this, the Panasonic GameCube. The way the Panasonic GameCube works on the back, the component port is completely isolated and separated from the audio ports. In other words, this, even though it only requires the component port, it won't physically fit. I would have to chop that off. Now, I can't imagine there's too many people that are trying to get HDMI out of this thing, but if you do, keep that in mind. You'd have to cut that off in order to work. I assume then it would, but I have no way to test it. Japanese stock GameCubes worked, PAL GameCubes worked, North American GameCubes worked, and Uber modified, even with HDMI output, GameCubes worked. So it worked on everything else. And so that brings me to one other point I want to make about this device that is actually very, very encouraging. So here's the thing about the GameCube when you're playing it. It renders a digital video signal. Duh. And then it outputs, if you're going through component, which is natively anyway, the best way to get video quality out of it, what it has to do is it goes from digital briefly down to analog and then back up to digital. Now that little wave can create additional video noise. Now the HDMI modified GameCube over here completely bypasses that problem by just going through it taps straight into the digital signal and outputs that, as therefore resulting in the best possible image you can get out of the GameCube. Now I asked the owner of Castlemania Games, like, is that the case? Is that how this one works? Does it do the wave, or does it go straight through? He says it goes straight through. So as a result, the picture quality off of this is essentially identical to the actual HDMI mod, which is nice. The difference comes down to additional like bells and whistles like the menu, as well as possibly sound issues, or at least sound differences. Let's describe it that way. So that said, one thing I really appreciate about this over the HDMI modified version is the obvious. This thing is like locked to that console. It's just that one. Whereas this can be popped into essentially anyone other than this one, basically.
All right, time to take a look at some comparison footage. So I've done what I usually do, where I basically connect to the console through multiple different outputs. You can see in the upper left corner what you're going to be looking at any given time. So composite right here is the standard one. It's the one that you guys typically see or have been playing or associate with playing the GameCube in North America. And eventually we're going to run through all the different versions and you get like a real good sense of it. And then you're going to get really sick of this clip. I apologize in advance. I decided to use this Star Wars Rogue Squadron because A, it looks really, really good, and B, it's not a Nintendo game, so they're not going to come after me or do anything about it. So that's always a plus. So a few other things that I want to mention that perhaps were unclear, I can answer them in advance. This is also compatible with, you know, like all the peripherals and things. Like nothing like that's going to change. The one that's most important, of course, is the Game Boy player. The Game Boy player is compatible with progressive scan modes. So as a result, your Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games can take advantage of this, and they can look absolutely stunning. You can see here I'm running an RGB. I don't know what it is about the GameCube. Maybe it's because I'm using a PAL unit, obviously, because only PAL units supported RGB Scart, but it always records differently than everything else. As you can see, it's just a little off. So I really just kind of include it as a technicality. I think that if I wanted to get like the best out of it, I would have to have some sort of PAL version of a recorder. I'm not really sure. I typically run into issues with the PAL GameCube when it comes to recording, but that really doesn't matter. It's not the point of this video. But in regards to PAL stuff, though, I will say this. You guys saw that clip earlier. That was from Taxi 3 Les Jeux, a French exclusive Canadian, or sorry, Canadian, I don't know what I'm saying, French-Canadian. It's an exclusive French game for Europe that only came out on the GameCube over there. Or maybe it came out on the PS2. But my point is, it only came out in Europe for the GameCube. And so you notice the footage was kind of jittery and stuff. Again, I think that might have something to do with PAL stuff, because I noticed when I played with the same game running through component, like this is now 480p component, there was 480i component a moment ago. 480p component, by the way, is the best the GameCube looks with the actual standard cables, and the HDMI adapter and of course the modification surpass this. Then again, PAL games do not support this, but if you run it in component 480i, you run PAL games, they typically look better than they do running through HDMI through 480i. It's something about the PAL edition of the GameCube that it really doesn't cooperate. So here is the GCHD running in 480i, again the exact same scene. This is with the progressive scan disabled, mind you. You will see it with it enabled, but it gives you a good sense of the difference between this and some of the other versions. But yeah, that PAL stuff is largely a mystery to me. I feel like if I really want to do it that justice, I'm going to have to get some sort of PAL recorder. Like the one I have supports it, but clearly it's not meant for that, because I always have issues recording PAL stuff off the GameCube. But I just wanted to make you aware of that. If you're actually in Europe, your footage might look slightly different or slightly better. That's just what I have to work with. You guys have to remember, of course, this footage is, you know, captured and edited and then processed through YouTube and all that. So it isn't a perfect reflection of what you will ultimately see on your TV, but it is a pretty good sense of it. This, of course, is the HDMI modded GameCube, which I did an entire video on again, and I think it's a very good comparison to see what this looks like versus what the GCHD looks like. Now, this is here the GCHD running in its full progressive scan 480p glory. And a pro tip for you, by the way, remember that this thing was designed for progressive scan games. That's the ones that are going to shine. That's the one that are really going to take advantage of it and really what it's meant for. It just kind of does other things as a bonus feature. In order to use it, there's two recommendations. The back of GameCube games in North America anyway, and Japan, in the upper left corner typically have a logo that says like, hey, this is progressive scan compatible. Sometimes they never put it on there even though the game will support it. And other times they will. But the best way to do it is when you turn the console on, you put the game in, hold down the B button when you're going through the beginning menus. If the game supports progressive scan and you're holding down B, it will ask you straight up like, hey, do you want to use the progressive scan modes or not? And you should, of course, say yes. So that's the best way to always be sure. And then, of course, you know, it's the internet. There's going to be lists everywhere available for you to be able to check and see which games support it. But again, that's only only North American and Japanese games. So now I'm giving you, just kind of splicing it up here a bit, giving you a better sense of some of the more important, comparisons. The HDMI mod versus the HDMI adapter. Component 480p right here versus the HDMI 480p out of the GCHD. So you'll notice that the GCHD looks cleaner in my opinion, although the component adapter or the actual component cables look a tad more colorful. But I ultimately side with the GCHD and the HDMI mod, which honestly, in my opinion, I couldn't even really tell the difference. I thought they were identical. And in just a moment here, you're going to see the difference between the worst method you can do, sans RF, meaning composite, and upgrading to this thing. So you can see a composite switch to GCHD. Pretty big difference, right? Again, composite is what you've been probably using a large part of the time, especially when you were a kid, most likely, if you had it back then. That was really what most of us had access to. So switching to the GCHD is something special. And again, this is what the GCHD can look like on games that do not support regressive scan, which is still very nice, but again, really not the intended focus of the device. The focus is ultimately the progressive scan capabilities. So yeah, once you have that, that looks sublime. And to be fair to the GameCube, a lot of games support it, even though it wasn't that well advertised of a feature. They just kind of had it in there, and for Nintendo to have like kind of stripped it out the way they did, I'm still amazed as many games supported it as they did. So that's still cool. Now, if you're interested in it, again, there's going to be a link in the description. You can go ahead and check it out and use that coupon code to save yourself a little bit of money if you want to. Entirely up to you. So I want to thank Castlemania Games for hooking me up with this and just allowing me to be able to do the review for you guys. And as always, I of course want to thank you guys for watching. You guys are the best, and hopefully this helps you at all in your decision-making process between all these different versions. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all later.